So, I always love these kinds of conversations. I really do. Because I find this book very randomly in a gas station American, a petrol station in Botswana, in Maun. And the title is yellow. The book is yellow. It's got an elephant on it. It's got a target reticle. And it's funny what you said to me yesterday. The target reticle is actually on its rump. It's not on its head. And I didn't actually notice that until I went back and looked at the book yesterday. And the title of the book is Aim to Save. And I'm like, man, who is this guy? And the title of the book is, the author is Larry Patterson. And over my 16 days in Botswana and then 2 days of flying home, I finished your book and feel like I got to know Larry Patterson and his extraordinary life in Botswana. And Larry, I guess I'll just ask the hard question right off the bat. Botswanans' elephants, are they in peril? Are they doing well? Or do we have a lot more work to do?
That's a multifaceted question, but they're doing well if you think that they've increased enormously over the last 40 years. They are imperiled like most major wildlife populations, mostly because of human expansion. So there needs to be a real depth of thinking about what the future might hold for these populations. They have certain requirements that up to now that haven't been really limiting, but sooner rather than later they're going to be very limiting, and there's going to be unprecedented pressure on them.
What do you think the most limiting factor on elephant populations is, Larry?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What do you think the most limiting factor is for elephants in Botswana?
Well, elephants need a lot of space. It's pretty obvious if it's big animals and live in large numbers of, we've probably got about 150,000 elephants. Which is quite interesting in itself, because 40 years ago when I started working on closer to 50 years ago rather, when I started working on elephants in Botswana, there were 40,000. And we were up against the same sort of problems then, as far as people could see. People said that, the elephants need saving, whatever that really means. And they object, a vocal minority, growing minority, objected to any kind of utilization which involved killing or hunting, whatever, of elephant population. Now there's 140,000. And the same people say the same thing, that the elephants need saving. That whole problem sort of changed, that they do need saving now, but probably saving from themselves. They're expanding their range completely every year, as far as I'm aware. Although the latest survey the results haven't been released yet, although the survey was completed last November. Seems very strange. Maybe there's some reason not to release those figures. So yeah, the range needed for 150,000 elephants is an enormous amount of countryside or real estate, as you guys said. The moment we probably have it in Botswana, it's not going to always be like that. Botswana takes a lot of credit for having conserved its elephant population, but really it's just been a laissez-faire attitude, and the elephants have looked after themselves. Hunting has been such a minor part of it. I mean, people get upset about hunting of any elephant. Some people get upset about that. In fact, hunting hasn't had any effect, as far as I'm aware, on numbers. Numbers have just continued to escalate. But yeah, we're in a situation where unless we provide space for these elephants, they are going to eat themselves out of house and home eventually. It might be a long time, mostly because the human population is expanding at the same time. Since I've been here 50 years, both humans and elephant populations have increased by 4 times, which is a nice parallel to draw, but it leads to lots of problems.
Luckily, Botswana has a very, relatively small population. I think it's now at 2 million people or something like that, for a very expansive area. And you're right. I think I would agree with you that the touting of elephant conservation as a result of government influence or quote unquote hunting is a false rhetoric. I think that the elephants have a lot of space right now. There's lots of habitat in Botswana. Whether you can say that that was because of government intervention or not, and elephant populations have skyrocketed.
It has skyrocketed. And one of the reasons for that is that the government sort of effort to conserve elephants has involved putting in waterholes in areas where they extend their territory. And this can be seen in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, where there haven't been elephants for hundreds of years, if ever. And now there are hundreds of elephants in that game reserve because the government put in boreholes initially to try to conserve the desert species like blue wildebeest and stingbuck, particularly, which seem to be taking a downward turn. But the elephants have just gone in there and exploited that resort so much so initially it was just bulls on their wandering. It's what elephants do. The bulls wander far and wide and then go back to their more permanent territories when the water dries up. But now, if you leave the water there all the time by pumping, the bulls don't go back, and the cows and calves follow them in. And now there are resident herds of hundreds of elephants in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, which is just not ecologically suitable for elephants. It's a desert, and putting a few boreholes of water in a desert doesn't really help.
Larry, before we go any further, I always tend to just dive straight in and completely forget to introduce whoever I'm speaking to. So, Larry, would you just give an introduction to who you are? I obviously know you better than anyone because I've read your book. But for those that may not know who Larry Patterson is, can you give a little bit of history to who you are? And like when you arrived in Botswana, how long you've been, what your job has been, and what it's entailed?
Yeah, okay. I qualified as a vet in the UK with the idea of working somehow in wildlife. As a kid, I probably wanted to be a game warden or game ranger, like lots of others. But the politics of the time didn't allow that. I mean, things were changing. So I qualified as a veterinarian and came out to Africa to see if I could get work in wildlife. And started off in Uganda, kicked out of there by Idi Amin when he had his coup. So I moved then down to Botswana. Mostly the jobs I was offered were working with cattle, but I knew there was a lot of wildlife in Botswana. Eventually, after a year or so, I was asked if I'd like to work on buffalo because they were working on buffalo being a suspected source of foot and mouth disease. And so I moved across to the wildlife department in 1974. And I worked in the wildlife department for 10 years, doing research quite a lot on buffalo, but also aerial census of several species, primarily elephants, but others, even unusual ones like crocodiles as well. Another story. But, yeah, we worked on elephants a lot because they've always been prime species, and we realized even back then that they were the key to conservation in Botswana. Mostly because the old-fashioned idea was, I mean, it's still true. If you look after the elephants, the impala will probably look after themselves because you're
Yeah.
conserving that huge amount of territory for wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
Then I left the government I was rated working for government, and I left it in 1992. No, I'm sorry, I left it in 1982. It's a decade out. And went back into veterinary practice because I really didn't know at that stage, having been qualified more than 10 years, which end of the dog had the teeth. So I went back to England for a year, learned my trade again, and then came out and opened a clinic in Botswana, the first one. There'd been no veterinary clinics in Botswana. So that was only as a way of getting back into wildlife in the private sector. And I ended up running a veterinary clinic in Botswana with 3 other guys doing the cats and dogs, and I was away most of the time doing the wildlife work that came up, and which gradually increased. So that was for another 10 years. And my wife said, either sell this practice or come and run it yourself, because she was getting a lot of flack from disgruntled clients. So I sold it in '92, and I moved to Tanzania in National Park. I worked on a contract there to rehabilitate the National Park. I should say that I've got a master's degree. After I did my veterinary degree, I initially did a master's degree in wildlife conservation and specialized in national park management and planning, or planning and management, I should say. So I did that for 4 years in Tanzania. Beautiful, wonderful country, crazy government in those days. But and then I did a similar job in Zambia, working for the EU, planning national park. But what I got tired of in Zambia was I was used to having put up with corruption in the government of Black African countries, but it was eye-opening to me to see that the EU delegation and its offices in Belgium, Brussels, were world leaders in corruption. They made the Zambians look like beginners. So I had a big fight with I was actually working for an Italian company through the EU, and I just said, I've had enough of this. And I got out. And the only place I could go to really was Botswana, where I could continue my wildlife lifestyle. And we had a couple of kids by then, very small, and we knew there were schools in Botswana, black primary schools. We knew that Botswana was a sensible place. It had proper banking facilities. It had ability. You could buy a house, and in 5 or 6 years' time, you could sell a house, possibly at a profit. And it was the kind of place to go to with a young family when you wanted to stay in Africa. So I came back and started full-time wildlife consulting, and then that wasn't making all that sort of amount of money, so I went more practical and opened a company that taught and traded in wildlife between game reserves or between game ranches, which was starting to become very popular, particularly in South Africa. And there were 10,000 game ranches in South Africa and 100 in Botswana, for instance. Botswanas were big. Each one was an average of, say, 15,000 acres. The South Africans were small, average of about 4,000 acres. So they could not keep up with their breeding populations they wanted. So we had a ready market. Our big ranches had excess numbers. So we went out and caught them and sold them across the border. That was the bread and butter. And a bit of jam sometimes, but it was also a way of getting involved in conservation of highly valuable species, rhinos, giraffes, not so much elephants. In those days, we didn't have the wherewithal to move elephants. We moved a lot of rhinos, thousands and thousands of what I call all the rubbish, if you like. But commercially, the rubbish anyway. They're the impala, the wildebeest, the kudu, which are just like fleas on a dog's back in wild areas of Botswana. So we could catch thousands of those and sell them across the border. That was possible. I did that until 2015, when things changed economically in South Africa, and changed politically in Botswana, and it became not such a good thing. And I was at the age to retire, so
Sure.
kind of retired. And now I've been just doing odd jobs, chasing baby elephants with snails and things like that. Morning I got a call to go and try and find a hyena with a snare on, but it's very hard to find hyenas during the day. We'll have another look tonight.
Larry,
That's what I've been doing.
Larry, I know this is a little difficult of a question to answer because of sort of the humility tied to it, but could you say that, for the early 2000s and the late 1990s, you were the person for wildlife in Botswana?
I was the person for wildlife.
Did you? I guess what I'm trying to say is, was there someone else in Botswana that knew more about Botswanan wildlife than you in the late 1990s, early 2000s?
There were one or two people around. Sadly, one or two people died since then. But I think for better or worse, it's been a situation where up until very recently, all the knowledgeable people, experienced people in the business were expatriates. So either they left when things changed, or they got old and retired and went back home to Australia or Kenya or wherever. So, there were very few of us who were hands-on and experienced in Botswana over that 20, 30 years.
In the time, you've obviously been traversing Botswana and its landscape and its habitats for 30, 40 years now. That experience is incredibly valuable. If you, and I don't want to pick out a certain place because maybe you have some in your mind, have you seen a change? Can you not demonstrably, because there's no way to scientifically, through you saying anything right now, prove it, but for instance, you went to a certain place, maybe Chobe, over, the span of 3 decades. Has Chobe changed because of elephants?
Yeah, undoubtedly, yes. It's not as noticeable in Chobe because it had already started and proceeded quite a long way by the time I became active here in the early 70s. But the elephants were pretty much restricted to Chobe.
Because of the water?
Because of the permanent water, yeah. So they had already, at first we said, damaged the woodlands, and then we were told that was not politically acceptable. We had to say they had modified the woodlands, but they certainly changed them. But what has happened, what's been far more noticeable, is the fact that's been repeated far and wide as the elephants have spread out from 40,000 elephants to 140,000. Okavango particularly, which is one of the most beautiful places on earth, has changed dramatically in terms of its vegetation cover in the last 30 years. I was ecologist in charge, for want of a better phrase, of the Okavango for 10 years. And the differences now and then are stark. They're dramatic. In some areas, huge areas of certain species of trees have been damaged or disappeared, and the thing has just changed. And now there are elephants everywhere. You cannot go into the Delta without seeing evidence of or live elephants in large numbers. In the 1970s, when we started doing aerial surveys of the game of the wildlife in the Okavango, which we did 3 times a year, we very rarely I can number them on one hand, the number of elephants we saw on the western half of the delta. On the eastern half, there were 2,000 or 3,000. The western half, there were single figures. How it's changed. Now, there are, I don't know what the latest survey will come up with, but it will be way over 50,000, I would say. So that's a dramatic change. And that impact of those huge animals on any kind of vegetation has to be marked, has to be, seen. You can't deny it. Nobody denies it anymore. Nobody denies the science that we were trying to shout and scream about 40 years ago. But they still don't want to do anything that might involve hurting an elephant. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. It's changed that way. Hunting and killing are no-nos for a lot of people. And unfortunately, the way I look at it, for the environment as well. Those people, so we say the celebrity conservationists are damaging what they claim to be protecting. So when it annoys me intensely when someone like Stormstar, I don't know what's the guy from I can't remember his name now. The guy who was in
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Leonardo DiCaprio talks about conservation of elephants in Africa, blood diamonds and things like that. When he knows zilch, really. And I've spent 40 to 50 years of my life with 2 degrees working on it full time, and nobody listens to what I say, but they listen to what he says. That's very annoying. And that's not just me. There's a bunch of us. We're fighting at the moment with a thing called publication called Africa Geographic.
Oh, really? Simon Epsley. What an idiot.
Simon Epsley, yeah. We don't really need people like Simon Epsley, but he says he's campaigning against anti-trophy hunting. And I said, to what end? What do you want to do? Do you want to save more Botswana's elephants? Because we've got as many as we can use. And our president recently offered to give 80,000 elephants to Angola. How this is going to be accomplished, he didn't say. But I mean, that's the sort of situation that our politicians are faced with. They've got elephants coming out of their ears, and they're not allowed to do anything to them because the world will come down like a ton of bricks on them. It's a strange world.
Larry, let me ask this question, and I don't know if you've contemplated this or not, and maybe there's a very simple answer, but why were there not 120,000 elephants in the 1970s?
Well, it's probably a complicated answer and not be really 100% accurate. But in the period,
was it poaching? Was it a massive poaching?
Sorry?
So go ahead. I didn't mean to cut into you.
No, there's never been any significant elephant poaching in Botswana. When I arrived, there were 40,000 elephants. And various people said various things about why there were 40,000 elephants and not more. I think that, this one theory is this cycle of, may not be right, of plus minus 200 years, when the vegetation changes, when elephants change the vegetation to grassland, and they move on, the grassland becomes forest again. And that whole thing takes 200 years. Maybe there's an aspect of that. Also, there was the serendipitous situation around I think it was 1902, which destroyed pretty much all the wildlife in this part of the world. And the other species, particularly the bird species, buffaloes and all the antelopes, had to build up and down. They've all increased since, in the last 120 years. And where they've been allowed to, where the human population has allowed it, they've thrived. We've never had a serious poaching problem I don't think of any kind in Botswana except for rhinos. is
Mm-hmm.
a situation,
Mm-hmm.
a special situation.
Larry, Botswana is well known for beef being, and that's where you started as a veterinarian in Ngami land in terms of the beef production, and a really significant GDP of the country is beef. And because of that fact, and because of the immense wildlife resource that the country has, they put in these buffalo fences, which essentially cordoned off areas in Botswana and really made it to say, look, there's areas in this country that are cattle, livestock, people type areas, and there's other areas in this country that are wildlife areas. It seemed necessary from a business perspective, obviously for the GDP, but what are your thoughts to the impact on wildlife? I don't want to influence your answer with my answer, but it seemed almost revolutionary to say, we're doing this, whether it was for wildlife or not, that was the outcome.
Yeah, it's obviously been a major issue for many years. The first veterinary fences were put up in the late 60s. They weren't really buffalo fences in the sense that later there were some what they call buffalo fences. These were just cordon fences across the parts of the country where they didn't want people to be able to move their cattle to other areas, which were clean in parentheses. There was a theory that even back then in the 50s, when Botswana's total economy depended on beef exports to Europe, there were no diamonds, they hadn't been discovered. So it was important that they continued this beef export. The Europeans insisted on animals coming from an area which could be checked for foot and mouth, which was clean of foot and mouth. And they suspected that there was foot and mouth outbreaks. Historically, there had been in the Okavango Delta, on the edge of the Okavango Delta, where cattle could mix with buffalo. So they cordoned off the northwest of the country, basically. They did not cordon off the Okavango Delta like it is now. That worked for a long time. It certainly caused huge deaths of migratory desert species, particularly the blue wildebeest, and it killed out zebras altogether from the Central Kalahari. They had to have access to water. They couldn't go backwards and forwards anymore, and they disappeared from the Central Kalahari. Blue wildebeest reduced in huge numbers, and it's all pretty well documented. It's a little bit hysterical sometimes, but yeah, it did have an effect. The fencing program continued in the 70s. We proposed, when I say we, it was a United Nations project, and it had 3 ecologists working on it. A guy called Alistair Graham, who was in Kenya, very talented guy, myself, a guy called Bill Axel, a British guy working in Zambia, who was concentrating on the plant side of things. I did animals, and Graham was my mentor. He sort of trained me in aerial censuses and stuff like that. And we, together with a guy called Peter Smith, who's sadly no longer with us, was a very knowledgeable, self-trained ecologist, very knowledgeable about the Delta. And we were worried that people were going to bring in cattle into the Delta. The cattle surrounding the area were starting to penetrate, particularly on the western, southwestern side. We didn't know how to stop it. Couldn't think of a good way to prevent that, because the land use planning and the ministry that was responsible for controlling people and where they lived and what they did was pretty weak. And it was an idea that we had, if we put in a fence around the Delta with the idea that we were like the older guys in the veterinary department were paranoid that foot and mouth could not get from buffalo into cattle, they would sense would be to stop cattle going into the delta. So it would prevent cattle from despoiling the beautiful Okavango Delta. There would be no cattle ranches in there. And we sold them that idea. It's kind of a paradox. They accepted it, they even paid for it, because the veterinary department had all the money, and nobody else had. So a couple of renegade vets who were more into wildlife than cattle persuaded the government to pay for a fence to stop the cattle going into the delta. That became known as the buffalo fence. And there were a couple of extensions to that. As far as I'm concerned, the fence is now. The buffalo fence has been a boon to wildlife. There are a couple of small areas where we had to sacrifice. Again, zebras seem to get hammered every time. We had to cut off a small zebra migration route. The zebras have settled down in the delta. There's several thousand of them there. They don't go outside into the area they're used to as much. So that was a bit of a sacrifice, but tiny compared with what we managed to save. The irony, again, everything moves on. And the irony is that now the elephants have destroyed those fences, and now the buffaloes come out from time to time. And the government, veterinary department's attitude now is to shoot the buffaloes if they come out. No one has ever yet had the nerve, and no politician's ever had the nerve to sanction it either, to allow shooting of a cow that went into the delta into what they call a free zone. It's what should happen. Buffaloes coming out, okay, shoot them if you must. Cattle going in, shoot them if you must. But nobody's had the balls to do that. But the fences are now performing a different function from what the earlier ones did. Even in the Central Kalahari, the ones that were condemned by Mark and Delia Owens so badly, they're now preventing, or were until the elephants smashed them as well. They were preventing cattle from going into the Central Kalahari game reserve. So they now have a different function altogether.
Yeah, certainly when we drove north out of Maun towards NG41 and went through the buffalo cordon there, the buffalo fence cordon there, it certainly is protecting vast tracts of habitat from livestock. And I'm not saying that livestock and wildlife cannot coexist, but it's a slippery slope on them sort of coexisting to then cattle dominating and people moving in and setting up settlements and setting up communities. And that buffalo fence has certainly stopped that. Plus also, obviously, the regulations and restrictions on certain concession areas and what you can and can't do and what areas people can settle in and not.
Yeah, it's true. The fence's function now is land use definition. To allow ranching for cattle in certain areas, to maybe it's even promote game ranching, and it can. There are many game ranches in Botswana that have huge cattle populations on. And if it's properly managed, that can be, like I think you were mentioning, that can happen. But in an unmanaged wilderness area, if you move cattle in and people with their unfenced tradition of allowing cattle to go free, then the game moves out. The game gets pushed back and it disappears. And they become cattle areas eventually, and that's a very sad state of affairs.
Larry, let me ask this question, and this is something that we contemplated in Botswana, and you mentioned it to start with. What is the morality of putting permanent water in place?
Was the word you used morality?
I did.
Okay. I haven't considered it as morality.
Because, and the reason I say morality is this, is because it provides a water source to wildlife, promotes more wildlife, but then also promotes sedentariness. I don't even think sedentariness is a word in the English language.
What do you mean?
That is a bad thing. But then also, it's not, and I expressed this to you yesterday, the placing of permanent water is not something that is solely restricted to quote-unquote hunting, right? You name the biggest national parks in the world, Kruger National Park, Wanky, you just mentioned Central Kalahari, where there is no hunting, it's ecotourism based, and they purposely drilled water for permanent water sources for wildlife viewing. Which again begs the question, from a morality perspective, people question hunting as this immoral thing, but ecotourism is fine from a morals perspective. Yet you're doing the same thing for wildlife through water, manipulation of water.
Yes, I hold the view that it's an unscientific and negatively affecting factor which destroys natural habitat. And from that premise, then it's immoral to do that. When you're comparing it with ecotourism, then you're looking straight at economics. If you want to enhance a place's desirability for tourists, and so you put in artificial water to keep animals there, and you're going to make more money from your lodge or whatever, or from your photographic tourism. And at the same time, you're going to degrade the environment, and sooner or later you'll end up moving on somewhere. It's just a slower version of the cattle guys coming in with their animals, and the place gets spoiled. In terms of photographic tourism, I had an argument with the previous president of Botswana when I gave a talk on comparing photographic tourism and hunting tourism, or mixed use, as it was called in those days. Areas in the Delta. In the 80s, we surveyed the Delta in many ways, and one way we came up with areas that were suitable for hunting, which we call multiple use, because we didn't object to some photographic use there as well, and other areas that we earmarked for exclusive use. They were smaller areas for exclusive photographic use. This exercise employed perhaps 20 so-called experts and produced several volumes of reports with a very detailed land use plan for the next 30 years in the Okavango Delta. All I'll say about it is it was pretty much ignored eventually, because the powers that be and the money wanted to go the photographic route, the big business. And so for instance, the Mambo area was highlighted as an area there should be absolutely no development, no motorized transport. Only thing way you could go in there was by Mokoro, dugout canoe, or on foot. It's now the most heavily utilized and prime area for the most expensive lodge probably in Africa. So those arguments we didn't win, I'm afraid. But that was a long time ago. We have to live with the situation it is now, but we still have to campaign against the footprint of these so-called eco-lodges, where they do more environmental damage than 100 years of hunting capacity, with their roads their diesel generators, their airstrips, and they, you know, a luxury lodge with 45, 30 people has, has to have with it a staff village of 100 people. And that village doesn't come without its environmental effects either. So it's really not what it seems at first glance. The photographic people have a much heavier effect on the Okavango than hunting people ever do.
You know, it's funny. What I saw in Botswana was actually, and I'm thinking about writing. I want to write a conceptual framework and submit it to, say, conservation ecology as maybe just a letter or an opinion. But it seemed like Botswana has the model. It has this harmonious model where ecotourism and hunting can work very well together. And you just described it, in that there's areas that should be exclusive ecotourism. It's where they're going to make the most money. It's where they're going to have the highest diversity, highest density of animals. You're going to have all those animal encounters. And then just move 20, 30 kilometers away from those areas, and you've got your very monotonous Terminalia sericea bushland, raisin bushland that, you know, you may have 3 or 4 things that you see in a 3-hour drive, and one of them is, or 2 of them is a steenbok, and one of them is an elephant. And I see it as very harmonious, and they shouldn't ever be in competition with one another. They shouldn't be enemies of one another. Both of them are doing the thing that we want them to do, which is conserve areas, habitat, and wildlife for our kids and our grandkids one day.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. There's no reason whatsoever that they can't coexist. Even if you take smaller, little areas in South Africa, like Pilanesberg. Pilanesberg's got one of the world's biggest casinos in it. It also allows trophy hunting, and it's a tiny area. It all comes down to management.
Shh, Larry, you're not supposed to know that. Shh, they're not supposed to know that.
But to go back to Botswana's situation, yeah, with reasonable planning, which they've had, whether they discarded it or not now, it can certainly be revitalized. But unfortunately, the fanatics on either side don't help, but the major fanatics are on the photographic side. They're making big money out of huge areas of exclusive rights for themselves and their 1 or 200 clients a year. And corruption plays a part, you know. They get favors because they dish out shares in their companies to powerful people. And so certain areas like the Linyanti and which are fantastic areas that could be used for hunting and for photographic, and that was the way it was planned way back in the 80s and 90s, are now exclusive to one company, which is a very, very well-connected photographic company. I think that's more immoral than the water thing we were talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we visited Sankuyu on the way out, and Sankuyu was one of those villages that were affected in 2014, in which they had a mixed-use system. They had ecotourism, they had hunting, and in 2014 that hunting disappeared. And essentially we're left with just relying on ecotourism. And yes, it's working, but not at the capacity that they wish it would work. And now with the change in government, the Sankuyu Trust has now petitioned the government and doing a review of its management plan to bring hunting back in a zone that is absolutely not used by ecotourism. Talking to our point, multi-use utilization of all of the land for different things that bring money to the communities and benefit the people of Botswana.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Those areas that came out of community-based wildlife conservation areas came out of a project which is paid for by the American government, CDNRM project, and it had fantastic success in areas where the natural resource base was adequate to provide enough income for the communities. Where it fell down, one or two places in the Kalahari Desert where the resource base was pretty sparse, it didn't perform as well. But where it really fell down is where the communities generated or were given, I should say, lots of money from selling of their government-controlled quotas of particularly elephants, but also other stuff, lions and stuff like that. So very, very expensive. The people weren't trained there was no honest broker to deal with the income. And very often it got squandered. You know, the couple of 3 or 4 guys at the head of the trust ended up with new Land Cruisers, and then the money was gone somewhere. And it didn't affect the community as a whole. I think those days, again, it's changing. And, you know, with the minded overseer of what goes on in those accounts, then it can be a fantastic boon for those communities. And they very soon, in most of those areas, realize that wildlife is a hell of a lot better than cattle in terms of their income for their villages.
Yeah, yeah. Larry, the last question I have, and maybe it's not just a question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. A very strong theme that came out of our 16 days in Botswana was this: water is life in Botswana.
Yeah, water is life. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I lost you there, but yeah, I mean, the national motto is "Pula, let it rain." Even more valuable than the diamonds. So yeah, water is very scarce in Botswana, and permanent natural water is restricted to the northwest corner, and that's where the wildlife should be. Stretching its territory by providing artificial water is not the way to go.
Well, I appreciate that answer. I quite like that. That Pula translated as "make it rain." I like that a lot. Larry, I think we could both probably talk for the next 2 to 3 hours about all sorts of things. And maybe next time I come to Botswana, and when we hope to finish this documentary and bring it to Botswana and do a premiere and showing in Botswana. Hopefully we can get an invite into you, and if you don't make it down, I come up and visit with you and sit down and have a cold beverage to whatever choosing you and I like, and watch the documentary together and continue this conversation.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. I look forward to that very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time, Larry.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice talking to you.